جسد من عراق. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي نقتفي أثر النجوم الممزقة دون خوف من البرق ودون أن تقع السماء علينا. نرتق أحزاننا بشمع الكنائس نحيك بها وشاحا من الصبر، ونرتشف ملامحنا بكأس من نبيذ الأمس، ثم ندفنها في الطين المبلل عله ينبت يوما بيتا من الذكرى. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي تندلق قلوبنا كأصداف متعبة تجري مع زبد البحر، تختلط دماؤنا بملح المدامع، وننجب طفلا آخرا ليكون حجرا في مقلاع الريح ونرجسا يتعقب خطى الشمس بعيدا عن سريالية النعش. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي يلبس كلانا الآخر، تكونين لي معطفا رقيقا ناعما مطمئنا كدعاء أمي، يلتف حولي ليحفظني من الذوبان، فأصير مومياء في هرم الخيمة لأبعث عندما تنتهي الحرب، أو ليكون شاهدا على جزع السهل، وأكون لك فراشا دافئا كبيرا مريحا مطرزا بالياسمين يتسع لكل هواجسك المنهكة، تريحين جسدك وتنامين فوقه دون خوف من عقارب البحر وعقابه. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي يعض البرد عظامنا ككلب جائع نفذت الجثث من حوله، وتبتلعنا الأمواج السوداء كوجبة خفيفة تسد فراغات أنيابها. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي تقطع النوارس الرؤوس وتأكلها وتهجر العناكب أوكارها، ونتخذ من خيوطها ملجأ لنا. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي تختنق المسافات المضطهدة وينتحر الهواء بين طوابير القمح، ولربما يصبح البارود مرآة نرى فيها القدر بوضوح أكبر. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي تتكسر عاداتنا أمام أعيننا، ولن نستطيع اللحاق بها. لن نسأل الله أن تمطر ولا أن يهبط الليل بالأغاني، لن نشعل الشموع المعطرة ونتلهف للرقص حولها. ستكون الشموع وطنا يرسم ظلالنا على جوانب الخيمة ليزيدنا عددا ودفئا. لن نملأ الكؤوس بالشراب الملون، بل ستكون كهوفا تلجأ إليها الصراصير هربا من غزارة الأقدام الحافية. في هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي كل شيء سيكون مؤلما باستثناء شيء واحد وهو الموت. وعلى الرغم من أنه لن يغير عاداته ولن يشفق على جسد من عراء يتقطر طينا في عش من قماش، ولن يضل طريقه في متاهة شاسعة تبدو فيها الخيام كأنها أكفان متراصة. ففي هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي سيأتي الموت خاطفا خفيفا حافيا حالما منتشيا، لن نشعر به ولن نسمع له حسا، لن نجرح ولن نخدش، لن ينتحر السقف فوق رؤوسنا، ولن تخنقنا الجدران الإسمنتية، لن ننزف حتى تبيض عروقنا، ولن نصرخ حتى يعدم صوتنا. سنموت فورا، سنموت فورا دون أن نشعر بأي شيء. أليس هذا ما كنت تطلبينه دوما يا عزيزتي؟ ففي هذه الليلة يا عزيزتي لا شيء يستحق الذكر، فهي مجرد ليلة أخرى نموت فيها كعادتنا ولا يشعر بنا أحد كعادته. Thank you. Thank you everyone. Thank you for coming. It's an honor for me to be here to share the stage with Noura, Erakat, whose work and words has been always inspiring for us. And for me as a Palestinian coming from Gaza and as a poet, I've learned always that sometimes like words, they're all what we have, just to remember, to resist, and to carry home. So that's why I'm here today with you to share these moments. And I have just one more poem. I didn't survive the war. لم أنجو من الحرب. ما زلت أذكر تلك الليلة جيدا عندما صارت الريح خنجرا وصرصور الليل ذئبا والعصفور ذبابة ونافذة الغرفة لغما والسقف فخا قد يطبق على صدري، على حنجرتي وأنفي في أي لحظة، ويهوي بي في سماء برتقالية مع كل قذيفة تسقط. يداي ترتعشان تحت بطانية شتوية في صيف حارق، عيناي داميتان نهشهما الماء المالح. جسدي ليس لي، سرقه الخوف وصار غبارا ينتظر أن يلتحم بالركام ليعود إلى حيث ينتمي، إلى موطنه وملاذه الآمن مع كل قذيفة تسقط. الآن وبعد مرور 10 أعوام على آخر الحروب، أولى العذابات في صيف تموز 2014، ما زلت أذكر تلك الليالي التي صارت ندبا على خاصرتي، تواسي كل شيبة تغزو رأسي وتخرق لحم جلدي الداكن وتطبخه على مهل من دون عزاء لحساسيتي المفرطة من ظل النار، وتطعمه لخفافيش الليل العارية قبل أن تشن حزاما ناريا آخر. الآن وفي عام 8 على غربة الروح والجسد في غابات الغرب المقفرة، الحرب تلدغ من جديد والسم أشد فتكا، أغتسل عنوة وأنام مصادفة وكم أحلم بالنوم. القلق يلتهمني ويمزقني بكل أنيابه كما يلتهم الأسد الظبي. يرهقني هذا القناع الحديدي والتظاهر وكأن شيئا لا يحدث، بينما النملة لا تجد ما تأكل. ويرهقني سؤال دافيد اليومي: إذا ما سمعت صوت أمي من جديد. تعبت من إعادة تدوير إجاباتي ذاتها، من تنهيدتي والصمت الذي يتبعها، من مجزرة قد تحدث، من مجزرة أخرى قد تحدث بعد لحظة، أو لربما تحدث الآن وأنا أحفر نصي هذا، وأنا أقرأ نصي هذا. اسأل حقول الشيب في رأسي ولا تنسى أن تعده خصلة خصلة، ودع كل خصلة تروي لك حكايتها عن كيف صارت شبحا وسط ليل غزة، وكيف كسرت الوقت وجعلته هباء لتولد قبل موعدها في 40، قبل موعدها ب13 عاما، قبل أن تتسع جمجمتي سنتيمترا واحدا، قبل أن تشق الخطوط العريضة جبهتي. الآن وبعد 8 أعوام لم أنجو من الحرب. الحرب تولد معنا، مع أسمائنا ومسمياتنا، مع أول صرخة وعقدة حاجبين وأول رضعة وختم شهادة ميلاد. نحن أبناء الحرب، نحن أبناء الحرب، فكيف للحرب أن تقتلنا؟ شكرا.
Esteemed audience, dear professors and students of the University of Ghent, dear Amnesty supporters, dear friends. Allow me to start with expressing our sincere gratitude to poet Ramzi Salem for his incredibly impressive performance and his deeply moving poems, A Body of Nakedness and I Didn't Survive the War. It is such an apt and sobering way to start this special evening. It describes what seems impossible to describe. With all our heart, thank you, Ramzi. My name is Wies de Graaf. I am the director of Amnesty International Belgium Flemish section, and on behalf of Ghent University, Art Center 404 and Amnesty International, it is an honor and pleasure to welcome you to the public lecture on the occasion of awarding the 2025 Amnesty International Chair of Ghent University to Professor Noura Erakat. A warm and special welcome to Professor Erakat, who is awarded the Amnesty International Chair for her courageous and relentless work as a human rights academic and attorney, and for reshaping legal and political discussions on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Dear all, Mohammed, a Palestinian man who fled with his family from Gaza City to Rafah in March 2024 and was displaced again in May 2024, described his situation in Gaza to our Amnesty researchers as follows, and I quote, "It is like an apocalypse. You have to protect your children from insects, from the heat, and there is no clean water, no toilets, all while the bombing never stops. You feel like you are subhuman here." End of quote. Today, the situation has only worsened. We are witnessing an ongoing genocide for 17 months now. At least 50,000 Palestinians have now been killed in Israel's genocide in Gaza. It's been a month since Israel banned again the entry of humanitarian aid to Gaza. Relentless bombing, no food, no medicines, no water. Confronted with an ongoing genocide in Gaza and ongoing war crimes in a context of occupation and apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territory and Israel, it is not easy to find words, light or hope. We can surely not close our eyes and just think things will get better. The only way to have hope is by taking responsibility and by taking action. It's our responsibility to not look away, It's our responsibility to work on knowledge and awareness raising. That is what brings the three partners of this event together every year. That is one of the core functions of our partner, the Human Rights Research Network of the University of Ghent. To get to the much needed change, we need knowledge and awareness raising, and we need activism. Activism is driving forward Amnesty International as a global human rights movement. When we take collective, long-term action, change is possible. Brave activist voices have shaped positive change in the past, and they will do so in the future. And such a brave voice for change is Noura Erakat. We are grateful and delighted to listen to that special voice tonight. Dear attendees, this is already the 16th time this event is taking place. The Amnesty International Chair is awarded each year to an individual who makes an outstanding contribution to human rights worldwide. Previous laureates were author Dave Eggers, Sister Jeanne de Vos, Thomas Hammerberg, Gloria Wecker, Elisabeth Watuti, and Shirin Ebadi, to name only a few. We are truly honored to add Professor Erakat to this list as a prominent Palestinian academic, lawyer, and activist. Let me take you briefly through the program of this evening. In a moment, the official awarding of the chair will take place by Vice Rector Mieke van Herwegen of the University of Ghent, followed by the public lecture by our guest of honor, Noura Erakat. After the lecture, there will be time for questions and answers with you all in the audience. Before we proceed to the award ceremony and lecture, it is of course appropriate to honor our special laureate of the 2025 chair with a laudatio and an introduction. Rather than in a speech, we will shape the honoring introduction into a brief conversation, for which I'm very happy to invite Brigitte Hermans to the podium. Brigitte Hermans is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Human Rights Center of Ghent University. Her main research focus is currently on the relation between art and accountability in the Palestinian and Syrian contexts. More generally, her main research interests are Syria, the Palestinian-Israeli question, transitional justice, accountability, and literature. On behalf of Ghent University, 404, and Amnesty International, I wish you all a warm welcome once again, and I wish you an inspiring evening. Thank you. Thank you, Brigitte, for joining us for this introductory conversation. First of all, maybe why is it important that this year, the Amnesty International Chair 2025, that we focus, that we zoom in on the human rights situation in Palestine?
There are a couple of reasons, of course. One you already mentioned, it's the unfolding genocide, the genocide that we saw unfolding in front of our eyes since October 23. Also the erasure and the erosion of the international legal framework, the fact that there is a generalized indifference towards the dehumanization of Palestine. And these are but a couple of reasons to do so, but there is, I believe, a before and an after the annihilation of Gaza, and we are at this very important rupture in time. And there is also a very important issue, which is the ongoing and the creeping even both-sidism. We see an approach in mainstream media, but more problematically in mainstream political circles, where there is this tendency to always look at both sides of the conflict, and this tendency is pernicious. We see it, of course, in policy circles, where the asymmetrical relation between an occupied people and an occupying power is just somehow erased because you want to create this idea of a balance. And we also see it with major outlets such as BBC, CNN, who would censor themselves, who would invite Israeli speakers, Hasbara, very often Israeli propaganda, which is presented as evidence, and therefore this confuses a lot of people. And I think this confusion, it also adds to the erasure of Palestinian perspectives and Palestinian voices. And because poets are so important, I thought that I also wanted to talk about the way how poets can also show how this erasure is taking place, and it comes also with regard to the question of the killing of children. And I wanted to quote a couple of lines of Fadi Joudeh, who's an American Palestinian scholar and poet and doctor. They did not mean to kill the children. They meant to Too many kids got in the way of precisely imprecise one-ton bombs, dropped 1,001 times over the children's night. They will not forgive the children this sin. They wanted to save them from future sins. And I think this kind of poetry, also what Ramzi showed, really brings out the devastation and the destruction that we need to erase tonight and other nights.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and within that context, and turning to our guest of honor, Noura Erakat, what is the significance of Professor Erakat's scholarly work in shaping our understanding, our reflection, our understanding of and our reflection on the human rights context in Palestine?
I think it's extremely important, and we had the occasion of listening to a couple of lectures already by Professor Erakat, and I think it's very important that she spells out in very clear words how the international legal framework failed us when it comes to Palestine. In her seminal book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, she draws very strongly on scholarship of third world approaches in international law. And of course, for a lot of legal scholars, this is an approach that they engage with strongly, but I think it's important that human rights defenders more largely familiarize themselves with this approach. And Dr. Erakat really shows how the failure of international law, building on that framework, is not a glitch. It's not something that happened by coincidence. It is not an accident, but it's on purpose somehow perpetuating the dominance and also the occupation of Israel and the devastation of Palestine more largely. And I think she does that in a very compelling way, legally, scholarly, and also in her scholarly work, she's a past optimist, as Emil Habibi would say, another famous Palestinian writer, or she takes a Gramscian approach, if you want, pessimism of the will. Pessimism of the intellect, rather, and optimism of the will, showing that, okay, the law fails us, but the law is not set in stone, and activists, civil society can also change politically through the law, and therefore we need to continue engaging with the law, and I think that's a very important contribution.
Yes, this also speaks to Professor Erakat's broader engagement, so to speak, and not just as a scholar, but also as a very committed human rights activist and as an advocate for political change. Maybe can you elaborate a little bit on that?
I think it's very interesting because a lot of scholars here and in other places, I think, can draw inspiration from that combination of activism and scholarly work. And a lot of people would shy away from that because, you know, you need to differentiate between both. But Professor Erakat shows that you can be an excellent and outstanding scholar and an excellent and outstanding human rights activist, and that it's important, especially in these very dark times, that we combine both. And it's inspiring, and it's also telling how Professor Erakat, for example, served as a legal counselor for the Badil Center for Refugees and Residency Rights. She also was a leading voice in the campaign to end the Israeli occupation, a campaign held in the US. And I think it's very interesting to kind of show how this legal work can also feed into grassroots work. It's not two different worlds, obviously. For people like us, I think it's obvious, but Noura also shows very clearly that the law can affect change politically and also inspire people in doing so. And she often also approaches the law and activism through other indigenous struggles in the US, Hawaii, Australia. And it's interesting to show that Palestine is also a transnational cause. It's a cause that doesn't stop, if you will, at the borders of Palestine, but it draws on common struggles, on common hope and resistance. And therefore, I think that this is also very inspirational when we talk about human rights work today.
Mm-hmm. That brings me to my last question, inspirational. You mentioned poetry. We also already heard the impressive poems of Ramzi at the beginning of the evening, the role of culture. Very briefly, that's your specialty, so to speak. You are doing research on the relation between arts and justice too. Why is this important in the Palestinian context, specifically, just very briefly?
Because Palestinian poetry and arts countered that erasure of Palestine. As Mahmoud Darwish said, poetry is not a luxury. He was a famous Palestinian poet, and poetry is needed in Palestine. It's where a lot of Palestinians unfortunately reside, and so poetry and arts also feed that resistance that we need so badly today.
Beautiful, thank you. Thank you so much, Brigitte, for this thoughtful introduction. And may I now please invite Professor Noura Erakat to the stage, as well as Vice Rector Mieke van Herwegen.
Good evening, everybody. Very happy to be here again. For me, personally, it's my 8th time that I'm here doing this in the 16 years of having had these Amnesty International chairs, always with the collaboration of Amnesty International. Very happy to do that from Ghent University side. You've already heard a lot about Professor Erakat's work and importance. I just maybe might want to add that in the letter we sent her, asking her to accept the invitation, what we wrote was, your courageous and relentless work as a human rights academic and attorney has reshaped legal and political discussions on the Israel-Palestinian conflict. Your book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine, offers a groundbreaking analysis on the role of international law and politics on this conflict. Moreover, you've foregrounded Palestinian Voices as co-founding editor of the online platform Jadaliyah, and you've shown deep commitment to advocating for a vision of Palestine that encompasses justice, dignity, and the right to self-determination. So, Professor Noura Erakat, it's an honor to congratulate you on behalf of Ghent University for your prominent role in advancing the human rights of the Palestinian people. You're a great source of inspiration to us all. You can see how many people there are here, especially to our students. With this Amnesty International chair from Ghent University, we want to express our admiration for your courage and your relentless work, and show our support for everyone who is committed to defending and promoting human rights. Congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Yep, the floor is yours.
Thank you. مساء الخير. شكراً كثير لكم. I must say I did not receive the run of show this evening. Had I received it, I might not have come. That was quite so very humbling and generous, but also so uncomfortable. In the literal sense, you know, as Ramzi poignantly pointed out, in this moment, as he's etching the draft of his text, someone could be stolen, another life could be stolen from us. So it's quite oxymoronic in this moment to be honored as my people, our people, are marked for elimination and undergoing a campaign to achieve as much. And I accept this award. I accept this award. But I accept it not for me. I accept it for the 2.3 million Palestinians who have been encaged in a human cage and hunted within that cage for the past 535 days, each of them far more brave than I can ever be, with far more courage than I can muster, with far more vision and resolve and dignity than I even knew existed. And so I accept that award because they cannot be here to tell their story. And it's by mere fortune, absolute strike of fortune, that I was born in Hayward, California, and not in Rafah, or Khan Yunis, or Beit Lahia, or Medinat Gaza. And so thank you to the University of Ghent and to Amnesty International. I understand that by also awarding me this, you are really platforming the ideas for which we all share and stand for, and I am a conduit on your behalf to amplify those ideas and to continue to forward them in a world that has seemingly lost its moral compass, and where we are doing our utmost in order to hold on to those shreds of our humanity and its potential. So thank you. Thank you. Today is day 535 of genocide. On day 531, the Israeli army launched a missile at a clearly marked press vehicle and assassinated Palestinian journalist Hussam Shbat. At age 21, Hussam could no longer continue his university education because Israel had destroyed his university and all major universities in Gaza. On these days, he wrote, "I was supposed to be walking the stage, graduating from college. Instead, I'm picking up bags of charred, dismembered bodies of women and children. We don't fear death. We fear a life without dignity." For the next 17 months, Hussam reported the genocide of his people. He heroically remained in the north, marked for ethnic cleansing, as indicated as early as October 13, 2023, when Israel ordered the evacuation to below the Wadi Gaza line, and then explicitly declared a site of ethnic cleansing upon the declaration of the General's Plan. When Israel placed Hussam on a hit list in October 2024, he pleaded with us to help protect him and his colleagues. He wrote, "I plead everyone to share the reality about journalists in order to spread awareness about the real plans of the Israeli occupation to target journalists in order to impose a media blackout. Spread the hashtag protect the journalists and talk about us." Hussam, by early 2025, 23 years of age, was displaced 20 times. Was starving, buried several of his friends and colleagues, but he survived 470 days of genocide when the ceasefire went into effect on January 19, 2025. On day 492, he finally reunited with his beloved mama. 19 days later, the only time his mama had with him, Israel unilaterally breached the ceasefire and resumed its annihilatory campaign. Though it had breached the ceasefire nearly 900 times already, though the first phase of ceasefire was fulfilled, and though Hamas insisted it was committed to a ceasefire so long as it included a permanent end to war, Israel breached the ceasefire with a renewed ferocity that has murdered 792 Palestinians in the first 7 days and counting. On the 8th day of this renewed campaign, just 3 days ago, Israel assassinated Hussam. He is now the 170th journalist to be killed. Hashtag protect the journalists. Preparing himself that we would not meet that call, the 23-year-old had already written his own obituary. If you're reading this, it means I have been killed, most likely targeted by the Israeli occupation forces. For the past 18 months, I have dedicated every moment of my life to my people. I documented the horrors in northern Gaza minute by minute, determined to show the world the truth they tried to bury. By God, I fulfilled my duty as a journalist. I risked everything to report the truth. And now I am finally at rest, something I haven't known in the past 18 months. I ask you now, do not stop speaking about Gaza. Do not let the world look away. Keep fighting, keep telling our stories until Palestine is free. Israel's onslaught on Gaza, where over 50% of the population is under the age of 18, is essentially a war on children. By attacking Palestinians directly, destroying 92% of the residential buildings, incapacitating all 36 hospitals, limiting the means of food, Israel is not only killing them now, but threatening the possibility of a Palestinian future. A campaign that seeks to obviate the future of a people is known as a genocide. Yet, despite these chilling statistics and an ICJ decision indicating its plausibility, there remains controversy, in the West at least, as to this basic fact. Why? The most pervasive talking point is that Israel is not targeting Palestinians as a people, but only targeting Hamas. Putting aside significant issues in law and fact, aside a lot of issues of law and fact to accept this talking point, let me just share with you some statistics that militate against it. What we know so far is that at least 2% of the Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, including over 20,000 children, buried, disappeared, and detained. The names of those under the age of 1 fill the first 14 pages of a 649-page document listing those who have been slain. So far, 902 families have been wiped off the registry completely, and nearly 1,500 Palestinians are the sole survivors of their families. This certainly exceeds the targeting of Hamas militants. But according to Israel, these horrifying numbers are irrelevant because they are the result, they say, of deliberate human shielding by Hamas. Again, putting aside significant issues of law and fact that would undermine even the introduction of this talking point, let me just share with you some of the tactics of the Israeli army itself that undermine their own talking point. The army has sniped children twice above the waist, used quadcopters to shoot children sprawled on the floor and injured, destroyed the largest in vitro fertility clinic, including 4,000 embryos, executed Palestinian patients with their hands zip-tied and thrown into mass graves, sexually assaulted detainees captured without charge or trial, bombed safe routes where Palestinians were ordered to flee, bombed safe zones where Palestinians were ordered to shelter, tortured medical doctors to death, destroyed more than half of Gaza's desalination plants, undermining access to clean water, leveled all 4 major universities, attacked factories, libraries, bakeries, heritage sites, 247 mosques, 3 churches, and bulldozed 16 cemeteries. As put by Professor Shireen Sayali, any honest observer of this war understands that the target of Israeli force and US-supplied weapons is the Palestinian civilian. Hamas combatants are the collateral damage. The purpose of this campaign is the destruction of the Palestinian people for the sake of achieving long-term Israeli security, what I call Nakba peace, a violent oxymoron that predicates Jewish Israeli safety on the elimination of Palestinians. In pursuit of its territorial ambitions to achieve unchecked Zionist settler sovereignty, Israel has removed Palestinians for 76 years and counting. It has imposed a permanent military occupation on the West Bank and Gaza for 58 years and counting. And it has besieged 2.3 million Palestinians in Gaza for 17 years and counting. What we have been witnessing for the past 535 days is the cruelest and most violent episode of the ongoing Nakba. On November 12, 2023, Agricultural Minister Avi Dichter told us plainly, this is Nakba 2023, a campaign that is evidenced across all Palestinian geographies, including in the Northwest Bank, where some 40,000 Palestinians have been removed from their homes in the past 2 months alone. And most recently, the Trump administration has adopted this goal in its current bid to build the Gaza Riviera and remove Palestinians to the Sudan, Somalia, and Syria. That is why the return of some 300,000 Palestinians to their homes in North Gaza in early 2025 was so incredible. It was the first time in nearly 8 decades of ongoing Nakba that we witnessed the return of Palestinians en masse, a return that embodies the national aspirations of the Palestinian people, as chronicled by Ahmed Aburtima, who marched home, an organizer of the Gaza March of Return in 2018, and who lost his 12-year-old son and who was injured early on in 2023. He wrote, I saw thousands of women carrying heavy bags while their children clung to their garments. Exhaustion and dust covered their faces as they walked, but they had no other choice. The path was barren and destroyed, littered with deep potholes gouged by bulldozers. Keeping children from falling into these holes added to the many challenges of this long journey. On that day, I walked as I had never walked before, almost 15 kilometers nonstop. I entered Gaza City, a dream long cherished during the days of war, now realized. Despite unprecedented cruelty, Palestinians refused and continue to refuse to surrender. And they marched home by foot. This is precisely why Palestinians are racialized as security threats, because they refuse to disappear. The Nakba is ongoing, but Palestinian resistance to their elimination is also ongoing. And while the only nuclear power in the Middle East, backed by global superpower, seems invincible, in fact, it has never been weaker. Israel has not achieved any of its stated military goals. Despite the lack of red lines in combat, together with an unyielding flow of weapons, primarily from the United States, but also from the UK, Germany, and Italy, in 17 months, Israel has only extracted 8 hostages through military force. 139 returned through negotiations. It has not decimated Hamas militarily, which, despite besiegement, has continued to demonstrate a capacity to fight across the besieged enclave. Domestically, Israel continues to fracture as its authoritarian elements take stronger hold on society, most recently indicated by the sacking of the Israeli Attorney General, as well as its chief security officer, and the outright betrayal of the families of the captives and hostages. Internationally, Israel has become more isolated, hanging only by a thread as the US uses its veto power to undermine the collective will of the international community. Rather than attempt to rehabilitate itself through cooperation and compliance, Israel has declared nearly all international institutions feebly attempting to hold it to account, like the ICJ, the ICC, the UN General Assembly, the Human Rights Council's Commission of Inquiry, UN Special Rapporteurs, as well as human rights organizations like Amnesty International, as anti-Semitic, rather than respond to incriminating mountains of evidence. Within the United States, Zionism is bereft of moral authority and self-described pro-Israel organizations have aligned themselves with the Trump administration to target immigrants, support their deportation, enhance surveillance, expand the police state, diminish speech rights, and racially profile Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims to silence criticism and protest. Polls indicate that for the first time since polling began among all Americans in 2001 on this issue, support for Israel has dropped to below 50%. Despite the unparalleled heartache and cruelty that we continue to witness, this is not a moment of despair. We must heed the words of Hussam. Do not stop. Do not let the world look away. Keep fighting. For the rest of my time, I want to focus on the role of law in this ongoing fight, and in our ongoing efforts to end the genocide at the very least and overcome the Nakba at best. I will do so by thinking about a striking juxtaposition that I want to share with you. The time of genocide in these past 17 months has also corresponded with the most remarkable time of judicial activism on behalf of Palestinians. In January 26, 2024, the International Court of Justice handed down a decision that decided that Israel was plausibly committing genocide, not because they couldn't decide more, but because at this preliminary stage, that is the extent of what they could have decided. In July 2024, the International Court of Justice issued another opinion, an advisory opinion, that declared that Israel's occupation in the West Bank and Gaza is unlawful, ordering it to withdraw its settlers and military from the territory and to provide reparations to the Palestinian people. And in addition to the ICJ, on May 20th, 2024, the International Criminal Court finally issued arrest warrants for Israeli leaders after nearly 12 years of Palestinian attempts to mobilize the ICC on its behalf. The juxtaposition of these precedent-setting legal efforts and the unyielding state violence against Palestinians raises many questions about the utility and even the meaning of law. Tonight, I will explore some of those questions by first considering how colonial shadows continue to shape the pursuit of justice within the ICJ, with an emphasis on how the normalization of Nakba has limited the potential of international law as a remedy. I will then turn my attention to the ICC to scrutinize how its structure of racial supremacy undermines its potential to achieve accountability and how it can nevertheless help advance emancipatory struggles. I will conclude by indicating where hope lies. Hint, hint, it's not the law. By the time genocide was proscribed in the 1948 Convention, genocides had taken place nearly throughout modern history, particularly in colonial contexts, though had not been prohibited or criminalized by any international legal regime. From the genocides of indigenous peoples for the sake of establishing American, Canadian, and Australian settler sovereignties, the Ottoman genocide of Armenians in the name of preemptive self-defense, the German genocide of the Herero-Nama peoples in the name of counterinsurgency, the genocide of Africans subject to the transatlantic slave trade and the captivity that followed, just to name a few. None had been legally condemned as the intentional destruction of the people based on their national, ethnical, racial, or religious identity. Their exclusion from the scope of harm partly reflects the development of the laws of war and international law more generally, as a European project that deliberately relegated the non-European as a savage other, ineligible for civilian or even combatant status. Such designation effectively facilitated the humanitarian regulation of warfare while simultaneously unleashing unprecedented violence against native peoples across colonial geographies without any sense of irony. And although Jews have been similarly racialized as Europe's other, excluded from whiteness, and denied citizenship, genocide was only named and proscribed upon its perpetration within Europe's shores. Genocide was ultimately legislated as its own unique crime that could be committed during war and peacetime, aimed to exterminate a people based on their immutable character precisely because of that character. What the convention, which was mostly negotiated between the four allied powers, the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union, defined as genocide is the intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group as such, and this commission of specific acts to achieve that goal. What the final text of the treaty did not include is also quite significant. Destruction of a group of people in the convention was limited to their physical destruction on purpose. It excluded the destruction of a group's political, economic, cultural, and linguistic existence. When it came to embedding a criminal legal definition, however, this raised alarms for colonial powers and settler colonial states to include the prohibition of such extermination. Cultural genocide was initially included in drafts of the Genocide Convention before being pushed out by primarily Western opposition led by France and the United States, and as well as the Soviet, despite Soviet and Third World attempts to reinsert it. As such, the final treaty effectively excised colonialism and its constitutive violence from the scope of the international crime of genocide. The convention failed to connect a group's biological life to the land upon which they live, thus obscuring how forced removal from one's land can be tantamount to a group's destruction even if its members survive. The way the convention has been interpreted by courts like the ICJ, at least to date, also implies that the specific intent to destroy a group should be understood so narrowly as to exclude the more protracted and systematic destruction of a group across time that is common to settler colonial contexts. Perhaps most significantly, the convention explicitly does not apply to the destruction of a political group, neglecting the ways in which groups with political affiliation can overlap with those who share immutable characteristics, particularly during wars of national liberation and struggles against racist regimes. The treaty condemned the destruction of a people, but not the kind of destruction perpetrated by the most powerful states. 2 years after the adoption of the Genocide Convention, Martinican artist and politician Aimé Césaire took aim at American and European self-absolution. He insisted that despite the self-aggrandizement of Western humanists, Hitler was not an aberration, but a reflection of the European context from which he emerged. The Nazi leader's distinguishing feature was that he, quote, applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for Arab, Asian, and African peoples in the global South. Hitler's transgression, Césaire emphasized, lay not in his annihilatory methods, but in his choice of geographic and racial targets. For Western powers, upholding a civilizational demarcation has required formidable gatekeeping to preserve, in the words of Professor Darrell Lee, a monopoly on how the term genocide is used. This took the form of exceptional treatment of the Jewish Holocaust as distinct in kind and degree from all other genocides. German scholars and politicians have distinguished the Holocaust by insisting that, quote, only Jews were killed for the sake of killing out of hatred alone, while all other victims of genocide were killed for pragmatic reasons, end quote. Treating the Holocaust as just another genocide, in the words of scholar A. Dirk Moses, is a taboo of the first order, despite the evidence of the actual historical record, which shows that leading Nazis studied and drew inspiration from annihilatory campaigns by ancient and modern empires, providing the evidence of historical continuity rather than rupture. What's more, Nazi records show that their campaign targeted Jews and other unwanted populations for their perceived role in undermining Germany's imperial ambition, meaning that hate was not the only catalyzing feature, but the associated outcome of a political logic. ICJ jurisprudence on the Genocide Convention has only narrowed the scope of the treaty's application. In Bosnia and Herzegovina versus Serbia and Montenegro, Bosnia went to the court as early as 1993 to accuse Serbia of exterminating Bosniak Muslims during the breakup of the former Republic of Yugoslavia. The military campaign aimed to establish a Serbian national authority in a territory where Bosniak Muslims constituted a majority and sought self-determination. To achieve its objectives, Serbia, as well as Serbian surrogates, intentionally starved, tortured, summarily executed, kidnapped, systematically raped, bombed civilian centers, disappeared detainees, and forcibly removed Bosniak Muslims between 1992 and 1995. The ICJ finally issued its decision 14 years later in 2007, and it did not contest the veracity of any of the factual record. But the court was not convinced that this was genocide. For the court in this reading, the mass killings of Bosnians happened with intent, but intent that may only rise to that of war crimes and crimes against humanity. The ICJ discounted the systematic destruction of archives, libraries, monuments, and mosques because the convention only punished physical destruction, not cultural annihilation. Most significantly, on nearly every count, the ICJ drew a very, very thin line between ethnic cleansing, committed for the purpose of forcing removal, and genocide, committed for the purpose of achieving destruction. Ultimately, the ICJ established a high threshold to demonstrate intent in genocide. They did, by the way, find one instance of genocide in Bosnia-Herzegovina committed by Bosnian surrogates, but that was it. To establish genocidal intent, the court said that there must either be a smoking gun, like orders to exterminate a group, a blueprint, and if that is not available, then such intent must be deduced from particular circumstances or a general plan. However, they continue, for a pattern of conduct to be accepted as evidence of a plan's existence, it would have to be such that it could only point to the evidence of such intent. The inclusion of only suggests that if acts, however criminal, would not suffice to demonstrate an intent, could have been committed for other reasons, like ethnic cleansing, like defensive purposes, and not merely for destruction, then it does not suffice to demonstrate genocide. The gate to demonstrating genocide remains incredibly high. In the case of Palestinians, these barriers to prosecution are even more formidable. The Nakba, which lasts between November 1947 and March 1949, committed in the shadows of the Genocide Convention, was excluded from the convention's scope, and Palestinians whose self-determination was forcefully thwarted could not accede to the newly drafted treaty. More, Israel, a state whose very establishment was viewed as a form of reparation for genocide's canonical victims, could not be conceived as its first accused genocidaire. The colonial shadow of the Genocide Convention, the narrow scope of the ICJ jurisprudence, together with the invisibility of the Nakba, makes the charge of genocide against Israel a significant legal challenge. Consider, just to tell you a little bit about this legal challenge and why it's so amazing that the ICJ even found plausible genocide, which I know was very unsatisfactory to many, but it was very significant. Consider recently the U.S.'s position of the genocide of the Masalit ethnic group in Western Darfur of the Sudan. In early January, in its last days in office, the Biden administration determined that the Rapid Support Forces, or the RSF rebel group in Sudan, is committing a genocide. In an interview with PBS NewsHour, the U.S. Ambassador at Large for Global Criminal Justice, Ben Van Schaak, explained that they reached that determination because, quote, of targeted killings based on ethnicity, statements in perpetrators' own words saying they want to eradicate particular ethnic groups from the region and entirely. We see sexual violence rampant. We see men and boys being killed, including infant boys, end quote. The ambassador continues, all of these are indicia of genocide. These are the types of things that prosecutors around the world will rely upon in order to infer that perpetrators are acting with genocidal intent. I would agree. In a refreshing twist in this segment, the anchor, Amna Fawaz, followed up by asking how the evidentiary threshold was met in Sudan, but not in Gaza. The ambassador squirms with platitudes, says a few things about a two-state solution and finding a political... But Fawaz presses on, asking her, when 2% of the Palestinian population in Gaza has now been killed, that to some says intent. You disagree? Finally, Van Schaak pivots and says that this is a matter before the ICJ, and so it will ultimately be for the judges to decide. With zero irony that they did not have to submit their evidence on the Sudan before the ICJ or any tribunal to conclude that it was genocide. This does not reflect a legal controversy, but a political one. The wholesale deference to the ICJ on the question of genocide of Palestinians is an attempt to deflect and pivot. The present-day counter-revolution against activists, I'm sure you all might be following some of this, especially in the United States, in the form of severe repression, is being waged for the purpose of reshaping a political climate so that it can reshape a legal outcome. This will be an even a greater challenge in a few years' time when the South Africa case reaches the merit stage of proceedings. At the merit stage, we were at the preliminary stage, at the merit stage, South Africa would either have to produce a document with a genocidal plan or show that the only reason for Israel's operation is genocide. Note that the plans for ethnic cleansing and resettlement wouldn't suffice because of the legal distinctions between ethnic cleansing and genocide. This outcome, of course, would be radically different if international law and its institution recognized the Nakba. However, the Nakba has been normalized among legal and diplomatic institutions. The UN, for example, had the opportunity to enforce UN Resolution 194, mandating the return of Palestinian refugees as a condition for Israel's UN membership, but refused to do so. Later in 1967, the UN Security Council Resolution 242, or Land for Peace, engineered a diplomatic consensus for a two-state solution predicated on accepting the Nakba as beyond legal and political contest. Scholar Rabia Aghbarieh further attributes this challenge to the fact that the Nakba is not recognized as a distinct legal concept, and he argues that although genocide and apartheid are universal legal frameworks, they remain closely associated with the case studies that canonize them, namely the Nazi Holocaust and apartheid rule in Southern Africa. And though irrelevant, divergence from these historical examples is often used to claim Israel's innocence. While the Nakba features apartheid and genocide, its primary element is the usurpation of self-determination and ethnic cleansing, as opposed to genocide's emphasis on destruction and apartheid's emphasis on domination. Absent the legibility of the Nakba in law, but really in our political legal system, as well as the erasure of a racial colonial analysis of Zionism, legal workers are forced to make their arguments in translation, which presents a daunting challenge that only promises imperfect outcomes. Historical phenomena that have normalized the Nakba as consistent with international norms since 1948 have underpinned the Western world's inability to name Israel's practices in Gaza as genocidal in 2023 through 25. The fact that the ICJ found that Israel was plausibly committing genocide was therefore quite significant. However, the fact that this conclusion was even slightly controversial after 90 days of a ruthless onslaught without red lines, together with the court's unwillingness to order its ends, makes this ruling equally insufficient. The long-standing normalization of the Nakba, together with the Genocide Convention's colonial blind spots and ICJ jurisprudence that further limits its application, makes it questionable whether the ICJ in its current form can ever really vindicate Palestinians. Really, that will be up to us and how we shape the political climate. If the campaign against Gaza is not genocide, then what is it? And if the ICJ cannot call the campaign by its name, then what value is it to the world that we live in? Failure to properly evolve jurisprudential standards and to adequately contend with genocidal violence in a settler colonial context will say more about the ICJ's relevance than about whether Israel has committed genocide. And here, really, it is not what the ICJ has to say about Palestine, but what Palestine is telling us about the ICJ and international law more generally. International Criminal Court. On day 227 of genocide, Karim Khan, Office of the Prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, filed arrest warrants for Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and Israeli Minister of Defense Yoav Gallant. The arrest warrants sent shockwaves, especially across Western capitals, as these were the first arrest warrants issued for any non-African or Arab leaders by the ICC since its inception in 2002, apart from the warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin. While precedent-setting, the warrants themselves reflected a problematic structure. The same filing by Khan also charged 3 Hamas leaders, Yahya Sinwar, Mohammed Diab Ibrahim al-Masri, also known as Mohammed Daif, and Ismail Haniyeh, with international crimes. The fact that Israel has assassinated all 3 of the Palestinian accused before the arrest warrants were even issued already indicates the severe power imbalance that the court cannot cure. No court can cure a power imbalance. If anything, it only reifies it through a framework of false parity. There's more. Not only did the warrant name more Palestinian leaders than Israeli ones, it also levied 8 charges against the Palestinians accused, in contrast to the 7 charges against the Israeli accused. Most significantly, the warrants charged the Palestinian leaders with extermination, the intentional and massive killing of a civilian population. Mind you, extermination is different than genocide because of the question of intent. But the Palestinians are charged with extermination in the warrants. They are also charged with rape and other acts of sexual violence, while remaining silent on those very issues in respect to the Israeli leaders. The warrants did not mention apartheid, a crime against humanity, or even settlements as a war crime, notwithstanding significant lobbying by Palestinian human rights organizations for nearly 9 years. Perhaps most telling, the prosecutor writes that in speaking with Israeli survivors, and I applaud him for this, so I'm not criticizing his empathy here, but I want to contrast it to the lack of empathy for Palestinian, but he writes that he heard in the warrant, he heard how the love within a family, the deepest bonds between a parent and child, were contorted to inflict unfathomable pain through calculated cruelty and extreme callousness. These acts demand accountability. In reference to the October 7th attacks, there is no similar expression of empathy for Palestinian families. Instead, it's a description, what included in their file is a description of methods of starvation and collective punishment, followed by the prosecutor's affirmation that, quote, Israel, like all states, has a right to take action to defend its population, but must do so within the bounds of the laws of war. The content of the arrest warrants are not surprising in light of the structure of the International Criminal Court and what Professor Kamari Maxine Clark describes as upholding European supremacy that helps mask and sustain core periphery relations of economic exploitation and inequality. And as Professor John Reynolds and I have shown elsewhere, if the institutional dynamics at the United Nations were different, we would certainly be directing all arguments and energies towards the necessity of political and economic sanctions against Israel itself, rather than criminal prosecutions of some officials. Remember, while the ICJ takes issue with state obligations according to the treaties of which they are party, the ICC is limited to individual criminal culpability. So let me share with you just a couple of other issues that further reflect the structure of the ICC for the sake of illustration. First, in the Rome Statute that establishes the criminal court, colonialism is not listed as one of the core crimes. Colonialism is also protected from prosecution through the temporal limitations of the treaty, which are not retroactive and limited by when states become party to the treaty. This is further complicated by the fact that of the 125 parties to the Rome Statute, Brazil is the only large member state, meaning that today more than half the world's population lives in countries that do not belong to the ICC. This is especially important when considering jurisdiction of the court, which can be established in one of three ways. To establish ICC jurisdiction, you can either get a referral by the prosecutor, 2, a referral by a state party, or 3, a referral by the Security Council. But of the Security Council, 3 of the 5 permanent members that have veto power, the United States, China, and Russia, are not parties to the treaty, and yet have the authority to refer other actors to the ICC's jurisdiction. Perhaps most significantly is Article 17 of the Rome Statute, which establishes the principle of complementarity, namely that the state of an accused individual has the right of first jurisdiction unless that state is unwilling and unable to prosecute them. In most instances, this is an evaluation of a national court's development and its capacity to prosecute international crimes, but really what it means is that the least developed countries will not be afforded complementarity, and the most developed ones will be recognized as having achieved it, putting those states and their crimes beyond the ICC's reach. So, it should not be surprising to us that since 2002, when the ICC comes into existence after a sufficient number of states ratify the Rome Statute, of the 32 cases that the ICC has handled, 26 have been from the African continent. The other 6 being Georgia, Ukraine, Afghanistan, and the Philippines, and Myanmar. And of the 60 arrest warrants, only 3 have been issued for European or Western heads of state, Putin, and now Netanyahu and Gallant. It is why, despite the fanatic accusation of bias against the court by Israel, accusing it of blood libel, most critics to date have noted that the ICC doesn't have an Israel bias problem, that the ICC has an Africa problem. In fact, by the time the genocide of Palestinians in Gaza was in full effect, the ICC was between a rock and a hard place. Either it risked the ire of the United States and other Western governments for its scrutiny of Israel, or it risked its legitimacy altogether by not prosecuting war crimes and crimes against humanity that the world has been witnessing in real time. It's for this very reason that this took so long. The former prosecutors of the court, understanding that the court is quite political and that they embody a political post, have pursued the Palestine case with overzealous caution. The Palestinian official leadership first attempted to give the ICC ad hoc jurisdiction over crimes committed in the Gaza Strip following Israel's first large-scale offensive in 2008-2009. It took 3 years for the then prosecutor, Luis Moreno Ocampo, to decline the Palestinian bid, stating that, quote, only states can join the ICC and give ad hoc jurisdiction, and we cannot decide yet that Palestine is a state. At the end of 2014, the Palestinian leadership acceded to the Rome Statute. Between the rejection of the first bid in April 2012 and Palestinian accession, we have a new prosecutor, Fatou Bensouda. And in between that time, also, the General Assembly voted by a large margin of 138 to 9 and 41 abstentions to recognize Palestine as a non-member observer state. Membership is within the exclusive purview of the Security Council, but they recognize Palestine as a state, which is within the jurisdiction of the General Assembly. Given Palestine's status as a state, as recognized by the United Nations, ICC jurisdiction should have become a non-issue, but controversy lasted still. Bensouda initiated a preliminary investigation now to determine the territorial scopes of the ICC's jurisdiction. That investigation took 5 years. In December 2019, the prosecutor determined that the court did have jurisdiction to proceed with an investigation into the situation of Palestine, and added that even though there wasn't a requirement to subject this to pretrial authorization before proceeding, that due to, quote, the unique and highly contested legal and factual issues attaching to this situation, that it would be referred to a pretrial chamber to determine the territory over which the ICC had jurisdiction. I'm sorry for the legalese in conveying this. Basically, they didn't know if they had jurisdiction, where would it apply, because Israel hasn't declared its borders. So what is Palestine? Okay? It took 5 years to determine that Palestine, that there was jurisdiction in Palestine was a state, and now it was going to be referred to determine what exactly is Palestine after 5 years. It took the pretrial chamber a year, a little over a year, to determine that Palestinian territory was the West Bank, Gaza, and East Jerusalem, despite fierce opposition from Germany, Canada, the United States, and Uganda. In February 2021, the ICC finally began an investigation, 12 years after Palestine's first ad hoc submission and 9 years after the General Assembly recognized Palestine as a state for the purpose of jurisdiction. Notably, and again, this is a nod to the political nature of the court, Bensouda made this determination the same month that she left office. And who did she hand it off to? Karim Khan, who is now our new prosecutor. Khan understood what was at stake and sat on this and did not proceed with the investigation until Israeli families requested his intervention and invited him to visit them after the October 7th attacks. He obliged and visited the region for the first time following their requests. He also visited Ramallah, but he did not visit Gaza. The political nature of the timing of his visit, accentuated by the fact that since 2015, Palestinian human rights organizations had been filing submissions to the court detailing Israeli crimes. The first 3 submissions followed Israel's first large-scale offenses of Gaza. The fourth was a 700-page brief filed in 2017 covering war crimes and crimes against humanity in the West Bank, including the crime of apartheid. The submissions detailed Israel's settlement enterprise, the 17-year siege of Gaza, the crimes committed during the Great March of Return in 2018. By September 2023, UN OCHA determined that 2023 in September was already the deadliest year for Palestinians in the West Bank since 2005. But it was only the attack on Israelis that compelled Prosecutor Khan's visit. The structural racism upheld by the Rome Treaty, as well as the court, together with the court's own politicization, impeding its intervention in the question of Palestine, are rightfully frustrating, if not infuriating. Still, and precisely for this reason, the arrest warrants issued for Netanyahu and Gallant are extraordinary and should be considered a victory. Why? The warrants for Hamas leaders were predictable and expected. Not only did the political organization submit itself to the ICC jurisdiction in 2014, Hamas submitted itself to the ICC's jurisdiction in 2014, but Western governments are already punishing Hamas with economic sanctions and diplomatic marginalization. It's one of the reasons you haven't seen any of their spokespeople on TV. Israel, on the other hand, has long benefited from a global legal exception, exalted as the only democracy in the Middle East, and has been a beneficiary of impunity, thanks in large part to the United States' role within the Security Council. Issuing warrants for Israeli leaders thus shatters a formidable diplomatic and legal taboo. In choosing between a rock and a hard place, the ICC chose to prosecute Israeli leaders. The cost would have been too high not to, even though the cost that they're now enduring is quite high. The stain of illegitimacy by not taking up crimes against Palestinians trumped the existential threat posed by the United States. And here, in sum, the U.S. is not only concerned about Israel, it's concerned about itself. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina was really clear that if they do this to Israel, they will come for us. He continued, quote, and this might have summed up my entire background for you, when he says, the Rome Statute doesn't apply to Israel or the United States or France or Germany or Great Britain because it wasn't conceived to come after us. Former President Biden was also outraged and called this, he called it outrageous, that the warrants were outrageous. And at the time, there was a bill in the Senate to impose sanctions on the ICC, but it was blocked by the Democrats in the Senate. But that was overturned when Trump came into office and issued an executive order. He declared an emergency and a national security threat because of the ICC warrants and has now imposed sanctions on the International Criminal Court, specifically naming Karim Khan, but also naming anybody that will assist the case as subject to sanctions. All right. There may be a discussion over whether the ICC is a source of harm. Some people might, after hearing all this, say, yeah, but none of that really justifies the structural racism that it upholds. I'm open to that. And that's a discussion. But short of that conclusion right now, the experience of Palestinians at the ICC indicates yet again that no law or court will save us. At best, the ICC arrest warrants are a tool for mass movements to agitate for the arrest of Netanyahu and Gallant upon their diplomatic visits, to highlight the double standard of rolling out the carpet for wanted war criminals and disappearing students and arresting journalists who oppose genocide. And it is a tool in the ongoing battle over narrative that we're now pitched in. It is many things, but it is not a source of justice and accountability that we demand. We, the salt of this earth, are the only source of this justice. We were the ones that marched in the millions across the globe insisting that there is no such thing as a justified genocide. We were the ones that rang the sirens in Guernica warning of a genocide, and the ones that wrote articles indicating this is a textbook case of genocide. We were the ones that occupied halls of power and insisted not in our name. The ones that refused awards, that marched in snow, rain, and heat, the ones that lined up at municipal councils, the ones that threw up tents on campuses to demand disclosure and divestment, the ones that played Hind Rajab's audio pleading for help and that renamed university buildings after her in her honor. We were the ones that made our own media when the media colluded against us. We were the ones that traced the weapons to the atrocities that they committed and filed the lawsuits. We were the ones that held teach-ins and prayer circles and circulated statements and fought and sued sitting heads of states. It was because of us that the Republic of South Africa could intervene at the ICJ, and because of us that the ICJ and the ICC had to act. Palestine has illuminated the colonial nature of the world. At this point, what the courts say about Palestine matters far less than what Palestine says about the courts. We are now in the throes of a pitched battle over narrative, and precisely how history will record this moment. It's precisely because of this battle, whether we remember it as a genocide or a counterinsurgency with untold casualties, that there is an ugly counter-revolution, especially where I'm in the United States, but also in Germany, and I see also in the UK to some extent, that seeks to pummel us because our adversary cannot win this argument, much less win our hearts. Things are incredibly tense right now, when students are being disappeared and others are being deported, when cities contemplate how to outlaw protests, and speaking Arabic in public has become a national security flag. It is unclear whether we will prevail in the short term to medium term to be able to write this history. But we have to remember that all of us here are at the beginning of this battle, and we are a bridge to the future, which will be led by a young generation that has come of political age in this moment. Palestinian freedom to this young generation is what anti-apartheid and anti-war have been to generations past. It is a moral barometer and a compass. They, along with millions across the world, recognize what Israel is doing to Palestinians in Gaza is genocide, regardless of what any court decides. For them, Free Palestine voices not only ethical solidarity with Palestinians, but a rallying call for their collective liberation. The attacks and smears they endured by their universities, police, and governments in response to their basic call to end the slaughter of babies has illuminated the undemocratic nature of Western society's ruling classes and the violence that sustains them. This may not bring an immediate end to Israel's campaign, nor an end to the occupation, or even lift the siege, but it does promise a political future wherein Palestinian freedom is central to questions of justice and the potential of a shared humanity. And that is far more significant than any legal decision can accomplish. Free Palestine. In the memory of Hussam Shbat, Hind Rajab, Sidra Hassouna, Sha'ban al-Dalu, Dr. Adnan al-Bursh, in the memory of Rifat al-Arir, Hamza al-Dahtouh, and Bara Abu Muhsin, free Palestine. Free us all. May we be victorious. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for putting all your intellect, which is just mind-blowing, but also your whole soul in this lecture and giving all that energy to us, that knowledge and that energy to us tonight. I really want to sincerely thank you on behalf of all of us. And yeah, starting from reminding us of the reality in a very eloquent way, going over your analysis on the ICJ and the ICC, and then ending with this call to action and what is in front of us and building that bridge to the future. I want to thank you very much. So as promised, we will open the floor for any questions you might have. At least in my mind, it was light bulb after light bulb going off in my head and understanding things, even doing this work for quite a long time as well as a human rights activist. But I'm sure people in the room will have some questions. We don't have too much time left for this Q&A session, but we will take a few questions if that's okay with you. You can just raise your hand and a mic will come your way, I believe. And I'm just looking at Bert if that's the case. Yes, that is the case. And please just let's use our time as good as possible. Make your interventions short and no long statements, but questions, please, for Professor Erakat. Okay, there's one question there for sure. Mic is coming. I'm also looking at the higher seats. If you have a mic, you can just ask a question because we cannot really see you. So please go ahead.
Hi. Hi. Yeah. Thank you. As a student organizer from the student encampment in Ghent, I'm really happy that you mentioned the student protest in one small sentence. And because the university is present here today, I wanted to ask you why you think, or if you think, that an academic boycott is necessary. And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Oh, it's okay?
I think so.
I really appreciate the fact that you're giving me options and mapping out how to... You have wonderful teachers, obviously, who have paved this analytical path, so I applaud them as well, and for your question. If I didn't talk about the students, it's really just because this, was trying to cover a bit of the analytical points. But I cannot talk enough about what the students have done. I cannot talk enough that in the moment it was in April where now we had seen the ICJ preliminary decision be issued, and then we saw impunity and a rejection of the provisional measures, right? Things had begun to feel like, wait a minute, why is nobody, isn't this what we were waiting for? And then boom, the students pop up on their campus and say, not in our name. And I think what the students demonstrate to us is that we all have agency. All of us, wherever we are. You do not need to be a tech billionaire to have power. You need to belong to a place. And as students at a university, you have agency. This is your institution. You will represent its legacy. They will forever benefit from you. It benefits from the faculty. It is the site of academic freedom, of faculty governance. It is the bastion in what would otherwise be democratic of the things that we should say and the ideas that we should share. And students understood that. And they didn't rally against their governments. Although, obviously they did in the protests, but in that moment, their agency was at their administrations. Universities have endowments. And those endowments must be ethical. And we have precedents for ethical investment in climate change, in human rights violations, but there continues to be this carve-out for the Palestine exception. And the students understood very much that this was what at stake and highlighted that contradiction, and the whole world witnessed you. So I cannot tell you how proud I am to be living in this moment and to have witnessed it. And you did it at great risk and great cost, so thank you very much. You're asking me a question about academic boycott. For full transparency, I was one of the leading faculty members who organized for academic boycott within the American Studies Association, as well as within the Middle East Studies Association, in order to achieve this through a democratic vote. So the short answer is, of course, I support it. Of course, I support it. Now, what gets thrown up in my face, in our faces, is that doesn't academic boycott inherently contradict my now celebration of academic freedom? And here I want to emphasize that this is not to limit academic freedom at all, but to limit how we partner, with whom we partner, and what we do in the name of the institution, right? And how we whitewash what an institution is doing, so that academic freedom in this instance is no longer something to be celebrated as a freedom, but instead becomes a fig leaf for violence. Because whose academic freedom are we talking about? The academic freedom of 100% of Palestinian children and college students who cannot get an education in Gaza? Or the academic freedom of the Palestinians who cannot travel from their home to their university because of a flying checkpoint? Or the academic freedom of Palestinian faculty who cannot study our own history because they're denied access to the archives in Jerusalem? Whose academic freedom are we talking about? And what about the imbrication of the Israeli academic institutions and apartheid? If we've agreed that it's apartheid, then do we not point to its partners in complicity who are perpetuating it? Hebrew University is literally built on Palestinian lands. Tel Aviv University has a Greenberg Forensic Institute which holds the bodies of Palestinians who have been killed. And trigger warning, and I'm not doing this for drama, but because I'm here to be honest, they're holding the body of my cousin now for 5 years, who was shot at a checkpoint 6 times above the waist, trying to take a Hyundai from Abu Dis to Bethlehem, 2 Palestinian cities, to decorate the car for his sister's wedding. And he was shot 6 times and killed. Left out, no investigation, no autopsy, declared on site for being a terrorist. And his body is still held hostage. Is this institution an institution I want to cooperate with academically? So I very much, I think what we're trying to do in this instance is to hold up and leverage cooperation with our colleagues to the extent possible. And the boycott actually says individuals are exempt. But the purpose here is not to whitewash the institutions that can continue to act as a fig leaf for continuing violence.
Thank you. Maybe we have time for one more question.
Oh my God, no, I'm talking too much. I'll make it shorter. I want to hear questions.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
No. You are fine. Is there anyone else with a mic we can't see, or any last question you might have in the room?
There's a
yes. Hand up here. There we go.
Nobody has questions. They all want to go to a rally. Let's go.
Indeed.
Thank you so much for your interesting words. It's very inspiring to hear you talk. So the previous question was about the protests that we see going on outside of Palestine, and that is, of course, very powerful, very important. But I also always admire the things that I see happening within Palestine and the resilience that I see within the community. So I just wonder if you can elaborate a bit more about what is happening on the ground, like the daily acts of resistance, and how much they can actually do by being under this constant attack of Israel. And I recently also saw this video where they were protesting on the street against like the Hamas regime, which is also something that is not easy for them because it's also quite authoritarian. But how much can they also do against the Israeli regime while being under this constant attack? So yeah, if you can talk a bit more about the power of their daily acts of resistance.
Yeah, absolutely. We had this conversation earlier, Brigitte and I, where, at first the reference to Palestinians was as victims, and then, we switched it to understand them as survivors. Because Palestinians are far more than the evil things that are done to them. That's not our story. What's done to us is not about Palestinians. That's about Israelis. That violence is their story and about them. And our story is very much about how we continue, frankly, to teach life. I've only been to Gaza twice. And I really, it's always this constant thing for all Palestinians. I mean, that's strange that I've been twice. Most Palestinians haven't, because we can't get in. It's literally an open-air prison with 5 points of ingress and egress, 4 of which are controlled by Israel, 1 of which is controlled by Egypt, but also with coordination with Israel. So it's this, when I see Palestinians from Gaza, right? It's this miracle. Like, we get to be with one another, right? So I can't tell you about the resilience of Palestinians because I'm proximate to it. I'm denied it as you are. But I've borne witness to it. And I must tell you that I have been, you know, when there's accusations that Palestinians are not humans, sometimes I nod my head. I'm like, you know what, you have a point. Because they're far, far, far more extraordinary than any humans I have seen, right? The ability to withstand this carnage and still create joy, to still celebrate birth, to still celebrate weddings, to still create schools, makeshift schools for children, to create makeshift clown shops for children, to still be able to cook with what's little is left, to be able to, I don't know if you saw this, but during the start of Ramadan, to decorate dilapidated buildings with a string of light. This is a people that loves life so thoroughly. They refuse to surrender to the threat of losing it. So it affects me. It affects me tremendously to think that I am in any which way related to this lineage. And I think I come from a remarkable lineage. And I am an ancestor to a future lineage. And we are remarkable. And teaching the entire world life. In fact, one of the things that has given me solace in a strange way is that if we actually don't figure out how to end the Nakba together, right, for Palestinians, then nobody's safe. There's no way Palestine is going to be sacrificed. 2.3 million Palestinians will be eradicated, forcibly removed, placed into smaller cages, right, expanding a militarized state, with the impunity and the support of the Western world, a collapse of an international legal regime established after the Second World War, where weapons manufacturers have more say than people and popular representation, where our voice has been subverted by liberal democracies through authoritarian means. To achieve this outcome, to eradicate Palestinians, will require that everything is destroyed. So what's at stake right now is all of us. That the fight for Palestine is the fight for ourselves. And I encourage you, I'm not answering your other questions on the politics. I think we'll go somewhere else. Let me stay here. But I'm happy to talk to you later. And to everyone, if somebody else wants to ask the question. But I just want to wrap this up and just say that really, this is not about you and whether or not you help the Palestinians. Frankly, the Palestinians are the most free people and have not surrendered an inch of their freedom. It's really about everybody else and what you're willing to endure and the future that you'll leave for your legacy and who comes after you.
Once again, thank you so much, Professor Erakat, for being so generous with your knowledge, wisdom, inspiration, and courage tonight, and with your energy. Thank you. I do believe the University of Ghent has a small token of appreciation or a small present for you, which I invite Giselle to bring. And please give Professor Erakat a final round of applause to thank her. Dear friends, we are at the end of this award ceremony, and as has been mentioned several times, we need activism to drive forward hope, and we would like to invite everyone in the audience as a final act tonight to actually take action to stop the genocide in Palestine, and we would like everyone to please scan the QR code which will appear on the screen, but it's also on your way out, it's on posters across the building. Please scan the code and sign the petition of Amnesty to stop the genocide, asking specific asks to governments worldwide, including banning arms trade, banning trade with illegal settlements, the access of humanitarian aid and other things. So thank you for doing this, for closing the night with taking action for Palestine. And once again, thank you all for being here. Thank you for the support, and a final special thanks to Professor Noura Erakat, the Amnesty Chair of the University of Ghent of 2025. Thank you so much.